My name is Eviana. I'm 29 years old, living in New Jersey and working in the cosmetics industry. A path I chose to carry on the passion of the only person who ever truly believed in me, my grandmother Lucille. She passed away just 1 week ago. But right there at her funeral, while I was quietly standing before her portrait, my father, Matthew Blackstone, stepped up, looked me straight in the eye in front of the entire family and coldly declared, "She's not blood. She doesn't deserve a single thing from my mother's estate." The whole room went silent. Not a single person spoke up for me. I thought maybe it was some cruel nightmare. But it was only the beginning of a truth buried for nearly 30 years. Have you ever been turned into a stranger by your own family? If you've ever felt like you were pushed out of your rightful place, share your story in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow along with me as we uncover the truth they tried to hide for so many years. I sat quietly in my car, still clutching the invitation to my grandmother's will reading. The ink still smelled like freshly printed paper, but each word on it felt like a knife tightening around my chest. Even after being publicly disowned by my father in front of the entire family, I was still named in the will. Something he clearly didn't expect and certainly didn't want. I lifted my head and looked through the window, watching the autumn leaves drift down in the yard. The air was brisk, but my chest felt even colder. Unlike my father's contemptuous stare, there had always been one person who saw what others chose to ignore: Lucille. I still remember those Sunday afternoons when she sat on the porch swing behind her old estate, holding a cup of jasmine tea, smiling as she watched me mix little bottles of perfume from dried petals and a few drops of essential oil. "Just because something's expensive doesn't mean it's good, Eviana," she would say gently, her warm voice curling around my memories like a shawl. "The secret is whether you understand the soul of the scent. You have to feel it, not just follow a formula." She was the one who sparked my love for cosmetics, not as a way to make money, but as an art form that touched people's emotions. When I told her I wanted to study this field, Matthew smirked and said, "Plain dolls with test tubes, huh?" He never supported a single decision I made, unless it aligned perfectly with the path he had drawn. In stark contrast to how he treated me, he constantly praised Logan and Ethan, my twin younger brothers. One won a business scholarship to Wharton, the other made Forbes' under 30 list. They were miniature versions of him, molded in pride. Since I was 12, I had heard the comparisons. First it was, Eviana should learn to be decisive like Logan. And over time it became, Eviana doesn't have a drop of Blackstone blood. I used to try not to take it personally, telling myself maybe I just wasn't good enough. But eventually, every word from him felt like a needle straight to my heart. And the worst part was, my mother rarely said anything. She had only one line she ever gave me, whispered after a particularly cruel scolding: "Don't be sad, honey. Your grandmother understands you." And she truly did. When I got accepted to a private university with a partial scholarship to study cosmetic science, Matthew didn't even bother attending my orientation. Lucille wore her purple coat, walked proudly beside me on campus, pinned my student badge to my white lab coat and whispered, "This is just the beginning, sweetheart." Every holiday, I made time to visit her, while Logan and Ethan were off in board meetings or on lavish vacations in the Bahamas. I would help her test new hand cream formulas, make scented candles from scratch, or simply sit and listen to her stories of how she was once ridiculed for wanting to start her own company in a male-dominated industry. They called me crazy, said cosmetics were a waste of money. But I made the first product right in this kitchen. One jar at a time, one person at a time, and soon all of New Jersey started using it. And now, she'd wink with a grin, I'm the crazy lady with 35 branches nationwide. That pride stayed with me, but Matthew never saw anything beyond numbers. He once said bluntly at Christmas dinner, "No one buys lipstick for emotion. They buy for advertising, market share, and branding. If you don't know how to sell, don't even dream of touching Blackstone assets." I froze, fork midair. Lucille simply placed her hand gently over mine. That one gesture gave me the strength to lift my head. I remember the day she took me to visit the original production studio on the outskirts of Atlantic City. She led me into a small room where she kept the first formulas, the original logo sketches, and handwritten letters from customers dating back to 1968. "Eviana, if one day I'm no longer here, remember this brand wasn't built on the Blackstone name, but on the spirit of a woman who wanted to make the world more beautiful. You're the only one in this family who understands that." I never imagined those words would become her final message to me. After the funeral, I returned to my small studio downtown. Even though I didn't own a single share in the company, I quietly developed my own product line. A brand no one had heard of, but every item tested and packed by my own hands. That night, I pulled out a handwritten letter she gave me the day I graduated. Don't let anyone else decide who you are. If they can't see your value, they don't deserve what you bring to the world. I hadn't fully understood her words. Until today, when my father exposed the truth about my bloodline in front of everyone like a dagger. Something was wrong. I could feel it. As if she had tried to warn me, but I hadn't listened in time. And in that moment, one question rose in my mind. If my father could disown me so easily, had he ever really believed I was his daughter at all? Or had he never planned to let me inherit a single thing? I was sitting in the kitchen, still holding a cup of tea gone cold, when the phone rang. The screen lit up with a familiar name, Mom. I hesitated for a second before answering. Since the funeral, there had been a strange silence between us. She'd avoided my eyes the whole time, only placing a soft hand on my shoulder as I left the memorial. That brief touch confused me more than it comforted. Eviana. Her voice trembled, small and unlike the calm woman I was used to. Can you come over tonight? I need to talk to you. Alone. About your father. I was silent for a moment, then nodded even though she couldn't see it. I'll be there. When I stepped into her living room that night, only half the lights were on. The warm yellow glow touched the edges of old family photos lining the hallway. One showed me next to Grandma at graduation. Another, me at age 3, sitting on Matthew's lap with my mother beside us, her eyes distant. She sat on the sofa in a gray turtleneck sweater, hands clasped around a glass of water she hadn't touched. I sat across from her, feeling like every heartbeat was a slow toll of a bell. Just tell me, I said first. I'm used to strange truths now. She closed her eyes briefly, exhaled. Matthew isn't your biological father. Felt like something clamped tight around my chest. I had suspected the possibility, but never imagined she would be the one to confirm it. You were born from a love story, she went on. A love I thought would last forever. I didn't speak. I waited. In college I met Jack Mitchell. He studied psychology, I studied literature. He had a rough past, an unfair accusation at his old school that was later cleared. But the Blackstone family didn't wait for the truth. When they found out I was dating him, they did everything they could to tear us apart. She looked up at me, eyes rimmed red. Back then, I was officially Jack's girlfriend. We had plans, dreams. But then, one phone call changed everything. Matthew found out. He came to me, charming, polite, but also very firm. He said if I continued seeing Jack, I would lose everything. My career, my reputation, and any hope of being accepted by the Blackstones. I gripped the edge of my chair. Every word from her mouth dropped like a stone into a dark well inside me. When Jack was struggling with the fallout of that false conviction, I got scared, my mother said, her voice trembling as if trying to hold back tears. I cut off contact with him and accepted Matthew's proposal soon after. Not because I loved him, but because I was afraid. Afraid I wouldn't be strong enough to stand alone. Afraid of losing the position the Blackstones forced me to maintain. Her voice cracked. When I found out I was pregnant, I was certain the child was Jack's. It all happened so fast. Jack had just left for a few weeks to settle some paperwork when I learned I was expecting. But Matthew, he simply declared the baby was his. He didn't ask, didn't wonder. Just claimed it as fact. And he held on to that like a golden ticket to secure his ambitions within the family. I looked at her, my lips quivering. Does Jack know? She shook her head. He never did. I couldn't tell him. By the time I tried, he was already engaged to someone else. And I was afraid you'd be dragged into a tug of war. I didn't want to hurt him or you. A soft breeze rustled the half-closed window, pulling with it the crisp sound of leaves. Everything inside me felt like it was drifting, floating away from what I had once believed. Why now? I asked. My voice was quiet, not angry, just heavy. Because Matthew crossed a line, she said, her eyes sharpening. The way he humiliated you in front of the family. The way he always tried to cast you out. I can't stay silent anymore. And I don't think Lucille wanted me to stay silent either. At the mention of my grandmother's name, I lowered my gaze. Memories flickered in fragments. Her cryptic words, the quiet looks she gave behind Matthew's back, the time she'd scribble something down and quickly tuck it away when I entered the room. "Where is Jack now?" I asked. She offered a wistful smile. "Vermont. He works as a groundskeeper for a meditation center. After his divorce, he pulled away from everything." I nodded, feeling something slot into place. "I want to meet him." She stared at me for a long time, then laid her thin hand over mine. "If you're ready. I believe Jack would want to meet you too." I didn't respond. But inside me a tide was rising. I wasn't looking for someone to replace Matthew. I just needed to know who I truly was. And if there was another truth beyond what I'd been forced to believe, then I would find it myself. The next morning I drove back to Lucille's estate. The sun had yet to rise fully. A misty veil clung to the stone path leading into the rose garden where she used to stroll each afternoon. My footsteps echoed faintly across the patio, as quiet as the thoughts unraveling in my mind, jumbled, uncertain but resolute. I wasn't exactly sure what I was looking for, but something compelled me to return here, like a memory left behind in the soft cream-painted walls, the worn wooden drawers, or the keepsakes she had cherished. I stepped into her study, a room always filled with the scent of lavender and the soft yellow glow of her desk lamp as she wrote by the walnut desk. Everything was untouched. The brass lamp still tilted slightly to the left. Her stack of notebooks remained in perfect order. And behind the velvet curtain was the wall safe I'd seen her open only once, long ago. I sat down and took a deep breath, then gently slid aside the orchid painting. The steel door emerged, dust gathering in its corners. My hands trembled as I typed in her birth year. A soft click broke the silence. The door opened. Inside there wasn't much. An old tin box. A thick envelope sealed with red wax bearing the Blackstone crest. And a small file clipped with a metal pin. I pulled out the first letter from the envelope. Her familiar cursive curved across the ivory paper. "My dearest Eviana, if you're reading this, I may no longer be by your side. But there are truths that cannot be buried with me. If Matthew uses blood to cast you aside, then he is the one who should be afraid. Because truth, like fragrance, can only be hidden for so long before it reveals itself. Trust your instincts. If at any moment you feel lost in the dark halls of this family, it's because they've lit you in the wrong direction." I paused, eyes stinging. Just one page, but every word struck a chord deep inside me. I opened the small file. Inside were 3 blood test reports, signed by a private clinic in Trenton. The first name, Lucille Blackstone. The second, Eviana M. Blackstone. The third was listed only by initials, JM. I skimmed to the conclusion. The medical terms blurred together, but the summary was clear. Probability of biological relationship between JM and Eviana M. Blackstone, over 99.9%. I rested my hand on the file, heart pounding. Tim Jack Mitchell. No more questions. Lucille had known. And not only known, she had quietly taken blood samples from both Jack and me, preserving the truth in a place Matthew couldn't touch. I couldn't recall when she had taken my blood, maybe when I cut my finger in the garden and she dabbed it with a special cloth, or when she mentioned testing for allergies and I didn't question her. As for Jack, perhaps she had gone to see him. Perhaps they had never truly lost touch. I sat motionless for a long time, caught between 2 worlds. One was the family I'd spent a lifetime trying to please, swallowing pain and rejection. The other was the truth. A truth both painful and liberating. I never belonged to Matthew. I was never the daughter he wanted. But I came from a different lineage. One my grandmother, the strongest woman I knew, had shielded in silence. Beneath the file I found an old photograph. In it, Lucille stood between 2 people, my mother and the man on the left. They were laughing, young, full of life. On the back was a handwritten note, Trenton, 1994. A day to remember. I returned everything to the safe but kept the letter and the lab results. That night I didn't sleep. I sat by my apartment window watching the city lights flicker like unanswered questions. If Lucille knew, and she did all of this, then she must have known Matthew would try to erase me. And maybe she knew I wouldn't let that happen. I picked up my phone and found the number for Jack, which my mother had saved the night before. I hesitated, then hit call. It rang for what felt like forever. Then a voice, low and hoarse, answered. Hello, Jack Mitchell speaking. I gripped the phone tightly, trying to steady my voice. Mr. Jack. This is Eviana. I believe. I'm your daughter. It took me more than 6 hours to drive from New Jersey to Vermont. The road wound through snowy hills, past small villages with white fences and moss-covered porches. Each mile added another beat to the storm inside my chest. I had imagined my biological father so many times, but never believed I would meet him. The address led me to a small wooden cabin nestled in a pine forest, about 10 minutes from the nearest town. The gate was unlocked. I pushed it open, its hinges creaking softly like a whisper to those inside. In the backyard stood a man trimming dry branches. His salt and pepper hair tousled in the cold breeze. His old, dark coat was speckled with dirt. He turned when he heard me, and those eyes, the very same eyes I saw in the mirror every morning, stopped my heart. Hello, I said, my voice raspy with cold and nerves. I'm Eviana, Diane's daughter. He stood frozen for a moment, staring at me as if trying to decide whether what he was seeing was real. Diane? He repeated softly, and though his voice was hoarse, it was filled with emotion. By God, you're Diane's daughter? I nodded, clutching the strap of my handbag tightly. I believe I'm your daughter too. Jack slowly put down the pruning shears and walked toward me. He didn't reach out to touch me, just stood there, one step away, as if afraid that if he got any closer, it would all disappear. I had no idea, he said, his voice choked. She never told me. I know, I replied gently. She said at the time you were engaged to someone else. She didn't want to complicate your life. He turned his face away, his shoulders trembling as if he had just taken a punch to the chest. I loved her, he whispered. I waited so long, but when I came back she was gone. The little house was warmer than I had imagined. It smelled of pine wood and dried orange peels. Jack made me a cup of peppermint tea, his hand trembling slightly as he poured the hot water. We sat across from each other at an oak table in a small, simple kitchen. Everything neat, every detail quietly serene and tinged with sadness. I didn't come here to blame you, I said, turning the teacup slowly in my hands. I just wanted the truth. Impossible. I want to know you. Jack looked up at me, his pale gray eyes like the early morning sky. I don't even know what to say. My whole life I felt like I had missed something, but I never imagined that something had a name, and it was Eviana. We sat in silence for a while. Outside the window, the wind rustled through the pines like whispers from the past. I brought this, I said, pulling out the blood test results Lucille had once hidden away. I placed them on the table and flipped to the final page, pointing to the initials JM. I think that's you. I'm not completely certain, but I want to be. Jack stared at the document for a long time, then gave a slow nod. There's a private clinic not far from here. An old friend of mine works there. If you're willing, we can go first thing tomorrow. I need to know too. I nodded. There's one more thing, he added, hesitating. I'm not sure if it's related, but a few years back, Lucille sent me a large sum of money. She said it was part of an unspoken responsibility and bond. I didn't understand it. I was going to return it, but she refused. After that, once a year she'd send a smaller amount with a note that said, "Keep it. One day you'll understand why." I sat in silence. You think that was because she knew? How I believe she did. The next morning we went to the clinic together. The staff there greeted Jack like an old friend. They took blood samples from both of us, did all the necessary procedures, and told us the results would be sent in 3 days. As we walked back to the car I had borrowed from my mom, Jack paused beside it. He looked at me, his eyes still full of emotion. I don't know if I can be a father at this point or if I even deserve to be, he said, his voice trembling. But if you let me, I'd like to try. I didn't answer right away. I simply stepped forward and wrapped my arms around him. A slightly awkward hug at first, but then it tightened as our hearts pounded in unison. No more words were needed. No questions about the past. We stood there for a long time in the stillness of the Vermont woods. And in that moment I knew everything was about to change forever. I returned to New Jersey in the late afternoon on the 3rd day, filled with a nervous energy I couldn't shake after waiting for the DNA results. The trip to Vermont had left a quiet space inside me, a truth taking shape, but also stirring a vague unease I couldn't quite name. Jack called me that morning, his voice hushed over the phone. They just emailed the results. Probability is 99.998%. Viviana. I'm your biological father. I don't know how long I stood frozen on the sidewalk near the coffee shop. People passed me in a rush while I felt myself slipping back into childhood. Those moments of coldness from Matthew, the unexplained looks of judgment, the absence of tenderness. Now everything made sense. And because of that, I knew the people behind the Blackstone name wouldn't take this quietly. That night, when I returned to my apartment, everything looked normal. I checked the windows, the locks, then turned off the hallway lights. But a strange unease lingered as I stepped into the bedroom. The curtains slightly askew, or the stack of documents on my desk shifted just enough to be noticed, even though I remembered aligning them perfectly the day before. I turned on the lights and scanned the room. No signs of forced entry. The locks weren't broken. But when I opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, where I had kept a copy of Lucille's bank records, those recurring transfers she had made to Jack, I froze. Everything was still there. Letters, some blood test reports, an old copy of the will. But the bank file was gone. I collapsed onto the floor, my heart pounding. This wasn't a normal break-in. A thief wouldn't take just one folder of bank records and leave behind both cash and my laptop. I sat in silence for a long time before reaching into my bag and pulling out my phone. I opened the security app I'd once installed to record suspicious sounds during the night. There was one clip, at 2:17 a.m. The sound of the window creaking open, soft footsteps on the hardwood floor, the faint rustle of papers, and finally, a door closing quietly. I took a deep breath, doubling over on the cold floor. And in that moment, the first name that surfaced in my mind wasn't Matthew's. It was Logan's. Logan had always been the quietest of the three brothers. He didn't insult me publicly like Matthew or strut around like Ethan, but it was exactly that silence that made me wary. Logan was the type who remembered everything, calculated each move. During family meetings, when Ethan argued, Logan would just smile faintly, arms crossed against the wall, as if the outcome had already been planned in his head. I suddenly remembered a week ago running into Logan in the waiting room of the same private clinic, where Jack and I had done our DNA test. At the time, I thought it was just a coincidence. Well, Jack, do you still have any records of the transactions from Lucille? Jack sighed. She always sent them by hand, never through the bank. But I do still have a few letters with her personal seal. Why, Eviana? I didn't answer directly. I didn't want him to worry, not yet. The next evening, I brought my laptop to a repair shop downtown, asking them to check if anything unusual had been installed. The technician examined it thoroughly, then pointed to a small chip near the charging port. This wasn't part of the original design, he said, frowning. It's a tracking device. No audio, but it sends real-time location data to a server. I froze. This was the laptop I used for work, where I stored all my schedules and personal emails. Ever since I began contacting the lab, I'd kept it open beside me. Which meant, everywhere I had gone, had been tracked. Can you tell me the IP address where the data is being sent? I asked. He nodded, spent a few minutes tracing it, then wrote down a string of numbers on paper. I took it to an old college friend, Brenda, who now worked in cybersecurity. It only took her a few seconds to find the match. The IP was registered under Blackstone Holdings, Private Data Division. Primary contact name, Logan Blackstone. The fury inside me surged like a slow-burning fire finally given air. Logan hadn't just tracked me. He had violated my privacy, stolen evidence, and possibly orchestrated a break-in at my home in the middle of the night. But worse than all that, I was beginning to feel, he didn't just want to block me from the inheritance. He wanted me gone. No one goes that far unless they fear something more than the truth. And I needed to find out what that was, before it was too late. I received the court summons on Monday morning, just 3 days before Lucille's official will reading. A thick envelope, sealed by the Essex County Courthouse with the cold, precise signature of Matthew Blackstone's legal representative. He was suing me for allegedly impersonating a biological heir to unlawfully claim part of the estate. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the words like they belonged to someone else. My emotions churned, anger, hurt, frustration, and above all, a deep disgust for the power games he was playing. What made my skin crawl wasn't the lawsuit itself. It was the evidence attached. A DNA test result between Matthew and me, declaring no direct biological relationship. I had never consented to any test. I never signed a single authorization for such a procedure. I called my private attorney, Carter Dunham, an old friend of Lucille's. He was the quiet, razor-sharp type who could read legal documents like computer code. "Carter," I said when we met at his office the next morning, "where did they get the sample?" I was never tested with him. Carter placed the copy of the test result aside, speaking slowly. "From a strand of hair. Likely collected during last week's family dinner. We're filing a motion to demand full documentation on the lab's chain of custody and procedures. This is inadmissible, unauthorized evidence." I clenched my fists on the table. "So can they block me from the will reading?" "Not immediately. But this lawsuit could delay the estate distribution process. And that," he leaned toward me, "is exactly what Matthew wants." I pulled a folder from my bag, copies of the official DNA test, co-signed by me, Jack Mitchell, and the Vermont-based independent lab. "This one's legally binding," I said. "And there's more. Jack isn't some stranger to the Blackstone family. He's Lucille's nephew, her sister's son. If I'm Jack's biological daughter, that makes me a legitimate descendant through the maternal line." Carter's eyes lit up. "Exactly. Collateral kinship through the maternal line is recognized in open-air wills. If we establish that link, the court can't remove you from the beneficiary list." The day of the hearing, the courtroom was packed. Matthew sat in the front row, clad in a charcoal gray suit, clutching a leather briefcase, expression unreadable. Logan and Ethan flanked him, silent and stoic. I entered with Carter, keeping my posture straight despite the storm churning inside me. Judge Annette Wexler presided, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a voice honed by decades of ruling over family disputes. "Mr. Matthew Blackstone has filed a claim against Ms. Viviana Blackstone, accusing her of impersonating a biological heir to fraudulently claim inheritance from Lucille Blackstone. Blackstone, do you have evidence to support this claim?" Matthew's lawyer rose. His tone was measured, flat. "Your Honor, we submit the results of a DNA test conducted between Mr. Blackstone and Ms. Viviana. The test confirms there is no direct biological relationship." Judge Wexler accepted the file, scanned the first few pages, then looked up. "Ms. Viviana, do you have a response to this evidence?" I stood, presenting the Vermont test results and the signed statement from Jack Mitchell's attorney. "I'm not disputing their results," I said, my voice steady, "but I never authorized that sample. It was collected without my consent, likely from a hair strand. In contrast, this DNA test was conducted legally with full documentation and confirms Jack Mitchell is my biological father with near certainty." I paused. Jack Mitchell is Lucille Blackstone's nephew, her sister's only child. Through him, I am a direct maternal line descendant, making me a legal heir under the provisions of Lucille's open lineage clause. A wave of murmurs swept the courtroom. Matthew remained silent, but I saw his hands tighten around the bench, knuckles white. Judge Wexler examined the records again, this time lingering on Jack's birth certificate and the extended Blackstone family tree that Carter had filed. "With conflicting test results and questionable sampling procedures," she said, "the court will postpone the official will reading until further verification is completed by a court-appointed independent lab. Furthermore, the plaintiff must submit proof of lawful sample acquisition. If not, the evidence may be rendered inadmissible." I exhaled quietly as we exited the courtroom. But I knew the war was far from over. Matthew never launched a strike unless he had the next 10 moves already planned. On the morning of the official will reading, the Blackstone estate felt eerily silent. Heavy velvet curtains remained drawn over the tall windows, letting in only slivers of light that cast fractured memories across the marbled floor. I walked into Lucille's study, the soul of the house where she read every morning, signed contracts, and wrote lavender-scented letters. Today the room was packed. Matthew sat directly across from me, stony and still. Logan and Ethan flanked him, their faces unreadable. I sat alone, beside me only Carter and Jack, the man I'd just learned to call Dad less than a week ago. A hush fell over the room as an elderly man stepped in, silver hair neatly trimmed, wearing a deep navy suit. His voice was low, calm, and hauntingly familiar. I am Richard Vaughn, personal legal advisor to Mrs. Lucille Blackstone for the past 30 years. Today, I am here to present a supplemental will, signed and notarized by Mrs. Blackstone 10 months before her passing. I caught Matthew shift slightly, a flicker of unease flashing in his eyes. He didn't know about this. No one on the family board knew Richard Vaughn existed, except Lucille. Richard pulled a sealed envelope from his briefcase, marked with a red wax stamp bearing an orchid, the flower Lucille loved most. He opened it with deliberate care as everyone watched. "Before we begin the formal distribution," he said, "Mrs. Lucille wrote a personal statement by hand. With your permission, I will read a portion of it now. I, Lucille Grace Blackstone, in full clarity of mind and judgment, draft this supplemental will to preserve the truths my heart cannot leave behind. I know the truth of Eviana Grace's lineage. I know beyond scientific tests that she is the daughter of Jack Mitchell, my nephew through my beloved sister. She is the product of a love too pure to be burdened by scandal. I don't need proof from a lab. I see Jack in her eyes and I see my own heart in the legacy she's built." I lowered my head, gripping the edge of my chair. That letter was more than an acknowledgement. It was redemption. That's why I've decided to restructure my entire personal estate, including my controlling shares in Blackstone Grace Laboratories, the commercial real estate system, bank accounts, and executive authority over the brand, transferring full inheritance rights to Eviana Grace Mitchell. This transfer is unconditional. She is not required to seek approval from any board to execute her legal ownership. Across the table, I saw Logan tighten his grip on his briefcase, while Ethan lowered his head. Matthew remained motionless, as if every nerve in his face had gone numb. Richard turned to the next page and his tone grew sharper, stripped of the earlier gentleness. "Matthew Blackstone, you were once my son, in name and on paper. But your actions, your words, and your betrayal have made it impossible for me to remain silent. Your denial of Eviana in front of the entire family, your abuse of power, and your use of legal manipulation to erase someone simply because she didn't bear your name, these are all undeniable proof that you no longer deserve the values this family stands for. Therefore, I officially disinherit you from all rights, including your position as an advisor on the corporate board. All your shares and voting rights will be redistributed based on the new shareholder structure, under the leadership of Eviana Grace Mitchell." A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Distant relatives nodded and whispered among themselves. Some looked at me with a mix of surprise and fear. I remained still, not in triumph, just feeling a weight begin to lift, like someone had finally removed a boulder that had pressed on my soul for far too long. "And the final part," Richard said, his voice dropping like a breeze through the pine trees at night, "is something Mrs. Lucille had prepared long ago." He brought out a thick file, its cover stamped with the title, Eviana Grace Foundation. Mrs. Lucille spent the last 2 years of her life establishing the foundation of this charity, aiming to support young women from disadvantaged backgrounds who dream of pursuing careers in cosmetic chemistry, biological research, and public health. Founder and executive chair of the foundation, Eviana Grace Mitchell. Hearing my name out loud, my throat tightened. I didn't cry, but my vision blurred. I remembered what Grandma once said, "One day you'll use what you're best at to help those who haven't had your chances." I never expected she would literally build an entire foundation so I could do just that. I looked at Jack. He placed a hand on the table and leaned toward me slightly. He didn't have to say anything. His eyes said everything. In a room full of people, I realized I had finally been called by my rightful name. Not Eviana M. Blackstone, the one forced upon me all those years, but Eviana Grace Mitchell, the granddaughter who carried her grandmother's faith, her love, and her final choice. A name that wasn't built on wealth but on truth. Before the rustling of documents could even settle, the study door suddenly burst open again. Every head turned. A man in a white shirt, black tie, and a tan field jacket stepped in, followed by 2 officers in federal uniforms. He held up his badge firmly, his voice cutting through the room with authority. "I'm Special Agent Daniel Price with the Financial Investigations Bureau. We have a warrant for the arrest of Mr. Matthew Blackstone for suspected embezzlement of corporate funds, falsification of financial documents, and obstruction of a federal investigation." The room froze instantly. I heard someone swallow hard. Logan took a small step back and Ethan paled, looking at his father like he was seeing a stranger beneath a familiar shell. Matthew didn't move. He didn't say a word. A muscle twitched at the corner of his mouth, and his eyes darkened like still water hiding the depth beneath. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he said, his voice low but lacking its usual conviction. "I'm the victim here. She," he nodded toward me, "is the imposter. She made this whole circus up." Agent Price didn't flinch. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder stamped confidential. "We've been monitoring you for the past 6 months, following a stream of anonymous documents sent by an internal source at the company. These include double-booked accounting reports, circular transfers to private equity funds in the Cayman Islands, and evidence that you used Mrs. Lucille Blackstone's name to sign fraudulent contracts." I turned to look at Carter. He gave a subtle nod as if he had anticipated this moment. Then my gaze found Jack. He said nothing, but I knew he was remembering what I had once told him. "Grandma prepared everything." Agent Price turned toward me. "We confirmed that the original source of the leaked documents was Mrs. Lucille Grace Blackstone herself. She initiated contact with federal authorities 11 months ago, gradually providing evidence to protect the family's estate from being siphoned. Her passing, while unfortunate, did not interrupt the investigation." The room seemed to tilt for a moment. That was when everyone realized every move Matthew had made, from rigging the DNA results to manipulating the board, had already been anticipated by my grandmother. "Matthew Blackstone," the agent continued, "you are hereby arrested on 3 primary charges, with further investigations into witness intimidation and attempts to derail probate proceedings." The 2 officers approached Matthew. He still didn't react. But when one officer touched his shoulder, the click of handcuffs broke the heavy silence, and suddenly he sprang up. "You have no right," he shouted like a cornered animal. "I built this empire. She is nothing. Just some stray mistake from my brother's stupid college fling." The slap echoed through the room, sharp and unexpected, delivered not by law enforcement but by Logan. He stood facing his father, eyes cold and hollow. "Enough, Dad," Logan said hoarsely. "You always told us to live with honor, to protect the Blackstone name. But the one who betrayed everything was you." Matthew froze, face flushed with rage as the cuffs locked around his wrists. He looked like he still wanted to fight, but no one in that room was listening anymore. I glanced at Ethan. He no longer had that smug air about him. His face was pale, his eyes hollow with shock. When our eyes met, there was no anger between us. Just the stunned emptiness of a son realizing the man he trusted most had sacrificed everything for greed. The police escorted Matthew out. The door closed behind them, leaving the grand estate in utter stillness. The ticking of the wall clock sliced through the silence like a knife through frozen air. I remained seated among dozens of stunned stares, but my mind drifted to Grandma, the woman who had foreseen all of this. The one who left me not just a material legacy but a key, the truth. 3 days after Matthew's arrest, I returned to the main boardroom of Blackstone Grace Laboratories. The long wooden table where so many strategic battles had been fought now hosted only a few familiar faces. A couple of senior advisors, 2 independent board members, and at the far end, Logan and Ethan. There was no arrogance in their eyes anymore. They sat quietly, heads lowered as I entered. I opened the file in front of me, my voice calm but firm. "I don't intend to drag either of you down with Matthew. But I also cannot keep a board composed of 2 men who, directly or indirectly, enabled the manipulation and damage to this company's name." Ethan looked up, his expression filled with something that resembled regret. I didn't know he'd gone that far. I truly didn't know, Eviana." I looked him in the eye, no anger, no plea for forgiveness. Just the truth. Not knowing doesn't mean you're innocent. You sat in those meetings and never asked a single question. You nodded out of habit, because you trusted the shadow of a powerful father. Now is the time for each of you to stand on your own feet. I placed a proposal on the table. I'm recommending that both of you resign from the executive board, with the condition that you retain your personal shares. That means you'll remain shareholders and continue to receive profit distributions, but you will no longer influence the company's direction or policy. Logan sat silently for a moment, then nodded. He didn't say anything, Just sign the document with a firm stroke of his pen. Ethan looked at me one last time, then quietly followed suit. I tucked the paperwork into my case, feeling the weight on my shoulders ease with every signed page. Real power doesn't come from removing others, but from knowing when to stop, and knowing who shouldn't walk beside you any longer. That afternoon, I stepped into my new office, the office of the chairwoman of the Eviana Grace Foundation, once Lucille's private study. The space no longer bore flashy decor or oversized oil paintings or symbols of dominance. Instead, I had placed a black and white photo of Grandma smiling with her first team of female employees, and a small shelf displaying the original prototypes of the Grace skincare line. On the desk sat her deep plum fountain pen, the one she used to sign contracts. I picked it up and flipped to the first page of the foundation's development plan. Every scholarship program, every vocational training session, every investment in community health clinics had been carefully mapped out by her. I reminded myself that I couldn't stray from the path she had started. She didn't build Blackstone Grace to profit at all costs. She did it so that women like her, overlooked, underestimated, and shut out of boardrooms, could rise and create real value. That night, I returned to the Lucille estate, now quiet with just Jack and me. The house felt larger than I remembered, quieter than I had imagined. Jack was in the study, where everything had begun, seated in front of a small wooden box filled with old letters, the ink faded but the handwriting still clear. "Would you like to read this?" he asked, his voice low and slightly hoarse. I sat beside him and nodded. Jack handed me a letter Lucille had once written to him but never sent. "Jack, by the time you read this, it may already be too late. But I need to say this. I've always known Eviana was your daughter. Not because anyone told me, but because every time she walked into the room, your eyes lit up in her stance. Her integrity, her persistence, and even the quiet loneliness behind her calm exterior. I never said it, not because I feared Matthew, but because I was waiting for the day Eviana would grow strong enough to find you on her own. Now she has." I folded the letter, my hands trembling slightly. Jack looked at me. There was no regret in his eyes anymore, only a softness and deep gratitude. "You're not a second chance, Eviana," he whispered. "You're the best thing that ever happened to both your father and your grandmother." I leaned my head against his shoulder. We didn't need to say anything else. The room glowed softly under the desk lamp. In that quiet, I understood that family isn't made by DNA or legacy. It's made by the ones who speak the truth, who hold each other with kindness, and who choose to begin again with love. As I sat in Grandma's old room, reading the words she left behind, I didn't just see the past, I saw the future opening wide. A future where truth no longer stayed buried. A future where love and integrity could rebuild even the most broken things. Maybe every family has its cracks, its shadows, and its unspoken truths. But what do you think? What truly makes a family? Is it bloodlines, or is it the people who choose to stay when everything else falls apart? I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you've ever felt dismissed, pushed aside, or forgotten, only to rediscover yourself through the rubble, share your story in the comments below. And if you want to keep following powerful stories about family, betrayal, forgiveness, and new beginnings, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss what comes next. Because sometimes, the truest stories are told in the quietest voices, just waiting for someone to listen.